Brooklyn, New York, 1953. 13-year-old newspaper boy Jimmy Bozart spotted a nickel lying on the pavement. It looked ordinary until he noticed a seam around its edge. When Jimmy examined it, the nickel suddenly split open. Inside was a tiny piece of photographic film containing a series of mysterious numbers. His father contacted the police, and eventually the FBI took possession of the strange coin. Investigators quickly realized it wasn't a normal nickel. Someone had deliberately hollowed it out and turned it into a miniature container for a secret message. But they couldn't read the message. The film contained groups of numbers that appeared to be some kind of code. The FBI suspected it might be connected to Soviet espionage, but they didn't know who had created the nickel, who was supposed to receive the message, or what the numbers meant. For nearly 4 years, the mysterious message remained unsolved. Then, in 1957, a Soviet spy walked into the American embassy in Paris. His name was Reino Häyhänen. He had spent years operating in America under the stolen identity of Eugene Maki. Now he had defected, and he knew exactly how Soviet agents communicated through concealed messages. Häyhänen gave American intelligence the information it needed to understand the mysterious code. The hollow nickel finally began to speak, and what it revealed pointed toward a much larger Soviet espionage network operating inside the United States. In 1948, Soviet intelligence decided that Reino Häyhänen could become something far more valuable than an ordinary intelligence officer. They wanted him to become an illegal, a deep-cover Soviet spy who would enter a foreign country without diplomatic protection and live under a completely false identity. Häyhänen had already worked for Soviet security. Born in 1920 into a Finnish-speaking family near Leningrad, he had become a teacher before being recruited because of his knowledge of Finnish. During the Soviet-Finnish War, he worked as an interpreter, translating documents and interrogating prisoners. Now, Moscow wanted him for an operation in the West, but Häyhänen had a wife, Alexa, and a young son. He was reluctant to leave them. He was given to understand that his family would eventually be able to accompany him. He accepted. His preparation included English, cryptography, secret photography, coded communications, dead drops, and methods of concealing messages inside ordinary objects. His preparation continued in Estonia, including Tallinn and Valga, where he continued intelligence work and developed practical skills that could support his civilian cover. Then the plan changed. Reino had been lied to. His wife and son would not be going with him. Alexa did not want to remain alone in Tallinn. Häyhänen eventually took her and their son to Tambov, Russia, where he said goodbye. Now he was going alone, and Moscow needed to turn him into somebody else. The Soviets found the perfect identity. Eugene Maki was a real American, born May 30th, 1919, in Enneville, Idaho. His Finnish-American family had left Idaho in the 1920s and eventually settled in Estonia after becoming fascinated by propaganda about the Soviet Union. But the reality was disappointing. The family became unhappy and wrote home about how much they missed America. In the late 40s, the Soviets obtained Maki's authentic birth certificate and built Häyhänen's new identity around it. The Soviets created a believable history. According to the new biography, Maki had been taken to Estonia as a child and, in 1943, had fled to Finland during the upheaval surrounding the Soviet advance against the German occupation. He was supposedly a refugee who had remained in Finland ever since. But Häyhänen hadn't actually lived that life. There was a 6-year gap, so the Soviets manufactured witnesses. Häyhänen was taken into Finnish Lapland, above the Arctic Circle. During a hunting trip, he was introduced as Eugene Maki. 2 local men were paid to claim that Maki had lived with them from 1943 to 1949. The Soviets had created witnesses for a life that had never happened. Häyhänen then entered Finland clandestinely. From 1949 to 1952, he lived as Eugene Maki, working ordinary jobs and establishing an employment and personal history. He wasn't simply memorizing a cover story, he was living it. During this period, he met Hanna Kurikka, a Finnish woman who had won a local beauty contest. He told lie upon lie to her regarding his new identity. She believed him, and they eventually married. Marrying, Häyhänen knew, would help his cover. It was a cold-hearted calculation, and Häyhänen obviously didn't care. In 1951, Häyhänen went to the U.S. legation in Helsinki. He presented the genuine Idaho birth certificate belonging to Eugene Maki and gave officials his carefully rehearsed biography. The foundation was real. Maki was real. The birthplace was real. His family really had gone to Estonia. The Soviets had simply inserted Häyhänen into the story. On July 28, 1952, he received a United States passport under the name Eugene Maki. A Soviet spy now possessed the identity and passport of an American citizen. On October 16, 1952, Häyhänen boarded the Queen Mary. His passport said, Eugene Nikolai Maki. On October 21st, the ship arrived in New York. Reino Häyhänen, the Soviet spy, stepped onto American soil. In New York, his first Soviet contact was a man known as Mikhail. They communicated through secret dead drops around New York. Then, in 1954, Häyhänen was introduced to another Soviet agent known as Mark. Mark was actually William Fisher, a British-born Soviet intelligence officer who would later become known as Rudolf Abel. Häyhänen now worked inside Fisher's clandestine spy network. He was now expected to identify and develop potential intelligence sources. After Hannah arrived in the United States in February 1953, Häyhänen and Hannah purchased a house in Peekskill, New York, in March 1953. The house helped reinforce the appearance that Eugene Maki was an ordinary married American with an established life. Soviet money was being supplied to support Häyhänen's operation. Häyhänen was also expected to maintain a legitimate-looking business cover. His Soviet superiors wanted him to have an occupation that would explain his income and activities while allowing him to continue his espionage work. A photographic business was proposed as his cover, but the venture failed to develop into the successful business the Soviets wanted. Instead, Häyhänen increasingly struggled to maintain the appearance of a respectable working man while taking money from Abel. Häyhänen's work was not simply about passing messages. The network was attempting to obtain American defense and military information and recruit sources who could provide it. The Soviets used hollow coins, bolts, pens, screws, and batteries to conceal messages and microfilm. But Häyhänen was becoming increasingly unreliable, and his work was yielding very little valuable intelligence. He had problems with alcohol, money, he fought with Hannah all the time, and his Soviet superiors were losing confidence in him. In 1955, Fisher and Häyhänen were involved in an operation involving $10,000 intended for Helen Sobel, the wife of convicted Soviet spy Morton Sobel. Because her apartment was under surveillance, they couldn't simply deliver the money. $5,000 was deposited in a bank. The other $5,000 was taken to Bear Mountain and buried in tin cans along a hiking trail, with markers showing where it could later be recovered. But Häyhänen lied to Moscow. He reported that the money had been delivered. When another $5,000 was sent, he kept that money too. Before defecting, he returned to Bear Mountain, dug up the buried cash, and took it for himself. His behavior had become a serious liability. In 1957, Moscow ordered Häyhänen to return to the Soviet Union. He left Hannah without a word. He feared what would happen when he got there. Instead, in May, he walked into the American embassy in Paris and made an extraordinary confession. He told American officials that he was a Soviet intelligence officer who had spent 5 years operating inside the United States. Häyhänen was brought back to America. Then he began telling the FBI everything he knew. And what he revealed was far bigger than one spy. He was exposing an entire Soviet espionage network. Häyhänen identified his two principal Soviet contacts. Mikhail was identified as Mikhail Severin, who had already returned to the Soviet Union. He also exposed William Fisher, also known as Rudolf Abel, his immediate superior. Häyhänen also revealed an American Army sergeant who had allegedly been recruited by Soviet intelligence. The soldier was Roy Adair Rhodes, known by the code name Quebec. Häyhänen described the Soviet dead drop system and the devices used to hide messages. The FBI followed his information to a dead drop in Prospect Park, where they found a hollowed-out bolt containing a secret message. Investigators also found a hollow Finnish 50 marka coin at Häyhänen's home, constructed in much the same way as the mysterious hollow nickel. Then came an extraordinary revelation. Häyhänen admitted that the hollow nickel had actually been intended for him. He had retrieved it from a Soviet dead drop, but before he opened it, he accidentally mixed it with his ordinary change and spent it. The secret message then circulated through New York for months. Eventually, it reached 13-year-old Jimmy Bozart. For 4 years, the FBI had possessed the message without knowing who it belonged to. Now they finally knew. It had been sent to Häyhänen shortly after his arrival in America. Häyhänen explained the Soviet cryptographic system. Using that information, FBI laboratory experts were finally able to decode the message. On June 3, 1957, the 4-year mystery of the hollow nickel was solved. But Häyhänen had given investigators something even more valuable. He described Mark, his appearance, habits, photography work, meeting places, and storage locations. The FBI followed those clues to a Brooklyn photography studio operated by Emil R. Goldfuss. On June 21, 1957, the FBI arrested Goldfuss. He refused to reveal his real identity. Instead, he gave the name Rudolf Abel. His real name was William Fisher. Inside his studio and hotel room, investigators found cameras, shortwave radios, cipher pads, microfilm equipment, hollow shaving brushes, hollow cufflinks, and other espionage devices. Häyhänen's confession had exposed the machinery of the Soviet spy network. The FBI now had names, dead drops, secret messages, codes, and physical evidence, and the network had led them directly to its most important American-based officer. Abel was tried in federal court in New York in October 1957. Häyhänen did not go to prison, became a key government witness, and then later a U.S. intelligence asset. On October 25th, the jury found Abel guilty on all 3 counts. On November 15th, Judge Mortimer Byers sentenced him to 30 years for conspiracy to transmit defense information, 10 years for conspiracy to obtain defense information, and 5 years for acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. The sentences ran concurrently, and Abel was fined $3,000. He appealed, but the Supreme Court upheld his conviction in 1960. He would serve only about 4 years. On February 10, 1962, Rudolf Abel was exchanged for American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers. What began with a 5-cent nickel had now become something much larger. The exposure and smashing of a Soviet spy ring operating inside the United States. And in the end, one of the Soviet network's own agents had accidentally spent the nickel with the secret message that helped expose it. Senator McCarthy's Red Scare was not so far-fetched after all. There are no public records concerning the fate of Hanna Karika.